Hey guys, in this episode, I discuss some interesting developments going on in near Asia, South Pacific with China, the militarization or the possible or probable or ongoing militarization of the Belt and Road Initiative, some possible implications of that, my take on it, and I discuss the political and other economic ramifications of some of China's ties with other parts of the world, how we can see how some of it's playing out politically. So, take a listen. I know you want to. So, let's discuss the Belt and Road Initiative in military terms. There's a great article that's being shared by some very reputable sources online from the Financial Review, and it's titled, China to Boost Pacific Military Presence, written July 10th, so yesterday. China's top defense officials has declared an intention to militarize the controversial Belt and Road Initiative to strengthen ties with South Pacific nations in what analysts warn is a significant challenge to Australia's strategic environment. Defense Minister Wei Fenghe told a gathering of military chiefs from South Pacific and Caribbean nations in Beijing on Monday that the BRI would provide a framework for greater military cooperation, undercutting the communist regime's public insistence it is intended to be a vehicle for peaceful economic development. So, right off the bat, the issue here is one that China has been publicly, the CCP has been publicly declaring that the Belt and Road is just peaceful, just economic partnership. So, I have said previously, I believe that the BRI has several goals. I believe one of those is military, right? I do believe that. I think one of those is to build out, have military bases in particular areas, have military capabilities in particular areas. Now, I obviously do not think that's the sole purpose. I do believe that there is a significant amount of the Belt and Road which is to keep, the Chinese economy moving the way it is. Also as a way to gain economic and political influence around the world. We'll get to that shortly. But let's continue with this here. So it says that Xinhua quoted the chief of staff of Guyana's defense force as telling Mr. Wei his country would like to strengthen ties with the Chinese military. So the article does not mention which South Pacific countries attended, but the meeting comes amid a rising battle for influence in the region between Australia, the U.S., and other Western allies on one hand and China on the other. So China denied last year it was seeking to establish a military presence in Vanuatu, while Australia and the U.S. have pledged to develop a joint naval base on the Manu Islands in response to concerns that Papua New Guinea was slipping into China's orbit. So the West is obviously, the U.S. and its allies are getting very concerned with the situation, which is rightfully so. So we know that China has been developing islands in the South China Sea, and the Belt and Road Initiative opens the door for further developments in this regard. So just think about it like if the Chinese are providing you loans and building out your infrastructure, then you're going to be more open if they say, hey, we need to build a military base here, or who knows what. Maybe that's part of an agreement, like they say, if you're not able to pay your debts, we're going to establish a base here. Not sure exactly how they would go about this, but it does work. It's clearly a threat to the current order. And I think a lot of people need to realize that a lot of this is not just military, the military issue surrounds economics and trade as well, right? I mean, for example, if the Chinese control certain ports, certain waterways and things because of island-based bases and things like that, they could control the flow of goods or stop the flow of goods internationally, which could be a problem. The article continues, Chinese President Xi Jinping has made the BRI a signature issue to promote trade and infrastructure, but it has been heavily criticized by the Trump administration for debt trap diplomacy, while Australia is also weary of the program. So Australia is obviously, they're paying attention to what's going on here. It confirms the essentially correct approach of the Pacific setup, and it demonstrates the point the government has been saying others, denying there is Chinese interest in establishing a military presence in some of these island countries. A Chinese base in the Pacific is going to be something that immensely complicates our defense planning, and we should work very hard to prevent that. So, and the article goes on to talk about how if China really wants to get a base in the Pacific, that somebody's going to give it to them, right? Somebody's probably going to give it to them. And the article goes on to talk a little bit about how the Chinese were observing the war exercises with Australia, Japan, and the United States, and that's just a little side note, But the idea here is that the Chinese influence is growing. The BRI, who knows? Like I said, I think it has multiple strategic angles. I think that anyone in this day and age would have to be super ignorant to not think that anything like this would have a possible military repercussions, just because of the nature of the world, right? I mean, the world is a potentially very volatile place, even though we've seen some peace over between the major powers, for the last, 40, 50 years, 60, 70 years maybe, depending on what conflicts you look at. There hasn't been major war outbreaking that's threatened the world. But when that happens, or if that happens, any major power would have to be an idiot to not be planning for that scenario. And the Chinese are planning for that scenario. I've said so before, that from the research I've done, from the understanding I have about some of Chinese history and the way that they have perceived the last century, I just talked about this, the century of humiliation. The Chinese do not want to ever be blocked off from their resources again. They don't want to be forced to the negotiating table in a military way where they cannot access things that they need. So in the past, throughout the 60s, 70s, and 80s, while China was developing, without all this infrastructure and these international ties to Central Asia and Southeast Asia and the Pacific and all of this, and Africa, the Chinese were effectively surrounded by either non-friendlies or U.S. allies, whether it be Japan, South Korea, the Philippines, or non-friendlies possibly like Vietnam or in Thailand, things like that. So China has been somewhat encircled for a long time. And the way that the Chinese work is like, if Kissinger is correct, they don't play chess, they play Weiqi, which, and I know I'm not using the tone correctly on that, but they play Weiqi, which is a game with stones, where you surround the opponent, and when you surround the opponent, you get their stones throughout different parts of the board. So the Chinese are most likely, the CCP is trying to avoid being surrounded. So how do you do that? You set up logistical and economic and military bases all around the world. Right? We do similar stuff, except it's not generally government funded, or at least I don't think so. There's probably government subsidies, but a lot of it is our companies go out and do it, right? Like we've got energy companies, oil and gas companies doing business around the world. We've got, I'm sure agricultural companies all over the world. We technology companies and stuff and mining companies all over the world, right? Well, China's taking a more state mandated approach, state directed approach. So that's the approach they're taking. Am I surprised at all that they are militarizing the Belt and Road Initiative? No. And to be honest, I think that you would have to be R-worded, you'd have to be retarded to think that they wouldn't do this. It's like the Chinese having ports or owning ports throughout the world. Basically, the Chinese are buying stakes in ports throughout the world, like throughout the Western world, in Europe, in Greece, in near Germany, and the Netherlands. And people are the government assures, look, we're not going to use these for military purposes, but they could. They could use them for military purposes, and it should be assumed that if they have to, they will be, right? That's just my opinion. So to talk about how Chinese influence, there's another interesting article being shared around by the Times of India, which said Nepal stops Tibetan refugees from celebrating the Dalai Lama's birthday. We'll talk about that in a second. It has to do with the influence of the growing influence of China right after these sponsors. Hey everybody, this ad is about a podcast called A Little About a Lot podcast. I have not seen it, so take it at your own risk. A Little About a Lot is a variety show by YouTubers. Kelsey and Becky behind the channel The Sorry Girls. Kelsey and Becky spill tea about their personal lives, talk about the struggles of relationships and dating. Becky is married and Kelsey is not. Oh my. Research their favorite celebs from the 90s, answer audience questions, interview some badass people, and more. We want to challenge perspectives and leave our audience feeling refreshed, inspired, and with a little more knowledge about a lot. Search your podcast app for A Little About a Lot podcast and subscribe to the A Little About a Lot podcast. And that is it for this. So an article by the Times of India says that the Nepal stops Tibetan refugees from celebrating the Dalai Lama's birthday. Amid growing Chinese economic and defense ties with Nepal, the latter has been reported to have stalled a program by Tibetan refugees to celebrate the Dalai Lama's 84th birthday. Media reports from Kathmandu said even several Western diplomats had expressed reservations over the move by K.P. Sharma Oli government. The permission for a public event to mark the Dalai Lama's birthday was denied, apparently because of security concerns. Nepal is said to be home to about 20,000 Tibetans. Krishna Badahar Katuwal, assistant district administrator of Kathmandu, was quoted by Reuters as saying the government refused permission for Tibetans to mark the Dalai Lama's birthday because infiltrators could create trouble. There could be a law and order problem, as infiltrators could organize demonstrations to try to self-immolate. According to Reuters report, airport immigration authorities in Kathmandu refused to admit a U.S. citizen of Tibetan origin and deported him last month, reportedly at China's request. So, why is this important? So, first off, the Dalai Lama situation is important in Nepal because there's lots of, Tibetans that in Tibet, in China, you're not allowed to engage in certain traditional religious, if you can consider Tibetan Buddhism religion, traditions or rituals, because it poses a threat to societal order over there. And the Dalai Lama is not looked upon. I actually don't know all the history about it. I'm sure some of it probably has to do with you shouldn't be worshiping anything really higher than the government. That's probably an issue. Maybe, I know in the past they've had civil disobedience over there, so maybe they're worried that the Dalai Lama would be able to encourage that. But regardless, the Chinese don't allow things like a celebration of the Dalai Lama's birthday. Now, in areas close to that part of the world, they have been a refuge for Tibetan monks or Tibetan Buddhists who have gotten out of Tibet and reside in the surrounding areas, like in Nepal. Historically, that would be a safe place to celebrate the Dalai Lama's birthday. But because of the growing influence of China, I was reading a lot of people's opinions about how China's funding schools and things like that China has a lot of economic ties with Nepal, and they're able to use those for political intentions. So this flows exactly into what I was saying earlier, that this Belt and Road Initiative and a lot of these Chinese investments, it's not necessarily just military, it's not necessarily just economic, it's not necessarily just political, it's everything. It's a whole sphere of influence, really, that they're pushing here. And Western diplomats and Western politicians are going to be concerned, yes, rightfully so. And I've said so before, I think we're going to continue to see a fracturing of alliances between the United States and other countries, especially China, because China is pouring so much money and resources into other countries. Now, people should be careful, right? China is investing in South America as well. In my previous one of my previous podcasts, I mentioned a list of countries in South America that are going forward with Chinese Belt and Road Initiative projects. The major countries like Brazil and Argentina are not, but they do have bilateral agreements with China. And I am not opposed to trade. I'm not opposed to infrastructure investment. But as we see, if China can use those investments in order to create military bases, that is obviously something that the United States should be watching, right? So, you don't want to have Chinese military bases, obviously, set up across, South America where they could launch attacks or launch defense or cut off strategic trade routes, right? I don't think China wants to engage in direct combat with the United States. I think they're trying to win a war without fighting, right? They're trying to surround the whole entire world as much as possible without having to fire a shot. So that way there is no fight. Speaking of that, let's take a look here at an interesting article that's also going around the Twitter sphere. Chinese troops in first joint medical drill with major NATO power in Europe. About 100 PLA medics, People's Liberation Army medics, are taking part in a 2-week exercise along with 120 medics and 120 support personnel from the German military. Focuses on humanitarian efforts with scenarios including an outbreak of cholera in a refugee camp and a bomb strike on a UN vehicle. The People's Liberation Army, the PLA, is staging its first joint medical exercise with major NATO power in Europe as China steps up efforts to strengthen ties with European countries. And it talks about the numbers, and there's personnel from Germany there. In addition to the medics, the PLA also sent a full array of field equipment, including armored ambulances, to Germany for the drill, which began on Wednesday last week and finishes on July 17th. It is the first time the PLA has shipped armored vehicles to Europe. The joint exercise is focused on humanitarian blah, blah, blah. According to China's Defense Ministry, the exercise includes a scenario of an outbreak of cholera and a bomb strike, Chinese-German soldiers working together to handle the situations. Very interesting. So, this is significant in several ways. I've said so before that, and I just mentioned it earlier, that China is going to be able to fracture the U.S. political Western alliance, and this is just an example of that, right? This isn't overtly negative stuff. I don't think this is necessarily inherently bad, but it shows that a country like Germany, I mean, if you're conducting joint military drills with China, they're not going to send, I think I mentioned this earlier, there was talk about Germany sending a warship through the Strait of Taiwan. No fucking way, right? No way. They have so much going on with China, and they are so weak politically. There's no way they would do that. And in my opinion, this just reaffirms my previous stance. Now, when I say no way, obviously I'm not making a prediction that it will or won't happen. In my opinion, it won't happen, but, who knows? So, just interesting stuff, interesting developments going on in the East. So I think I'm going to go ahead and stop it there. And I hope everybody has a great day.